Hey guys, so we're going to continue talking about chapter 16 and the industrialism spreading throughout America and just some things that helped make that happen at a very quick speed. Um, we talked yesterday about how we started talking about the railroads and how, some different innovations with those and consolidation of companies and just streamlining things made it to where the building of railroads was more efficient, and also railroad travel was a lot more efficient. And that is important because of the things we talked about in earlier parts of the chapter with what makes America able to industrialize so quickly. And it's the availability of raw materials and resources and our workforce, like our immigrants and the people in our country that were able to work. All of these things are going to allow industrialism to spread throughout the country at a very quick speed. So that's kind of what we're focusing on right now. Today, we're going to continue talking about that. We're going to continue talking about railroads and some specific railroads that were built and how the government and government policies also contributed to the speed in which industrialism spread throughout the country. So that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today. All right, so let's get started. So a couple of things. Let's talk about the government and what they have done to help with the spread of industrialism, the building of railroads. The first one is something we've talked about before, and that is the Gadsden Purchase. And I know y'all remember talking about that. But just to remind you, that was back when we talked about the Mexican-American War. After the war ended, the United States and the treaty with Mexico, we've got the Mexican Cession, all of that land in the Southwest that made up parts of Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, all of that stuff. We got in the Mexican Cession. Well, the Gadsden Purchase came after that. And that was when the United States purchased a small strip of land from Mexico that eventually would make up the southern border of Arizona and New Mexico. And the reason they bought that land in the Gadsden Purchase was they wanted to build a railroad, a southern route through that part of the country, connecting El Paso, Texas to California and other places out west. So that's one thing that the government does. They're just buying land from other countries like Mexico to help build new railroads in new places. Another thing that they're doing is probably a little bit more famous of an example, and that is funding the building of large railroad projects like the Transcontinental Railroad. So the Transcontinental Railroad, I'm sure you've heard of, but this was an idea that had been around for a while. In the middle part of the 1800s, Abraham Lincoln in 1860 and Republicans in general were very warm to the idea of building a transcontinental railroad. And transcontinental railroad, it's literally the idea of connecting the western part of the United States to the east. That's the whole idea, to have a railroad that spans, or a railroad network at least, that spans the entire continent from east to west. But it had been around for a while. Obviously, the Civil War happens, and this railroad kind of gets put on the back burner. 1862, Abraham Lincoln is going to sign an act that is going to start the process of getting this railroad built. But it's not really until 1864 and after the war comes to an end in 1865 that this railroad really starts to get built. The majority of it is built after the war happens, but the process does get started with Lincoln. But after that happens, kind of as we get into it in 1864, what the government's going to do is they're going to start taking bids from different railroad companies that want to be the ones that build this transcontinental railroad. Everyone wants to be able to say, all these different companies want to be able to say that they're the ones that built the first transcontinental railroad. Well, what ends up happening is the government awards two different railroad companies the contract, if you want to call it that, to build this railroad. So those are the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific railroads. So the Union Pacific is going to start the tracks and in the east, and they're going to build west. And the Central Pacific will do the opposite. They're going to start out in California, and they're going to build back east, and the two companies will meet together and join the railroads, and we'll have one long railroad. The Union Pacific was made up of largely of Irish immigrants and also war veterans, while the Central Pacific was made up almost entirely of Chinese immigrants. Okay, so this is really where you start to see these immigrants that are coming in start to play a role in the shaping of our country and what it's going to become. So these immigrants come in and they help to build these railroads. Now, the way that the government sets this up, the role that the government is going to play. Remember, we're talking about how the government and its policies can speed up this process of industrializing out west. So what they're going to do is they're going to give out grants to these companies in the form of money, first of all, and bonds, and also land. So a grant is basically, you can think of it like this. You've got loans and you've got grants. A loan is something, if the government gives it to you, a government loan, it's something that as a company you would have to pay back eventually. A grant, you don't have to pay back. They're just giving it to you. And the idea for the government is if you're funding this project, you'll reap the rewards later on, is the whole idea. So they're going to give these grants to these two companies. But the way that it's set up is it's based on how much money you get as a company is based on how much track you lay, how many miles of track you lay. So the government's going to give out 1,280 acres of land per mile of track that is laid by these companies, in addition to other things that we're going to talk about in a second. So basically, each company is going to get 400 feet or 200 feet on either side, 400 feet total as kind of a right-of-way, like this corridor for them to lay their tracks that they own. And then they're going to get alternating sections of land as well. So they're going to get a ton of land from the U.S. government on top of money to help fund this project. So because the government sets it up like that, it's based on the amount of track you lay. These two companies are building from opposite directions and meeting in the middle. Well, if I'm the Union Pacific, the more I can build and the further I can push the intersection of these two companies back west, the more money, the more land I get. So for both companies, it becomes this race to try and outbuild the other one. And that's going to have problems that we'll talk about in a second. But the whole idea is the speed in which we industrialize or the spread of industrialism out west, how fast that happens. And the government, the way they set it up, allows it to happen very quickly. And the Transcontinental Railroad is completed in really 5 years from when they really start to get going in 1869. But both companies, as they lay track, are going to have some problems. Just real quick to talk about a few. And most of it has to do with where they are, like the landscape, the geography. The Union Pacific, technically, if you want to think about it, has the advantage. If you're trying to lay more miles of track, the Union Pacific is building largely in the Great Plains, so it's a lot of flat ground. They can pretty much just go straight, and the process is very fast. The Central Pacific Railroad, starting in California and building back east, they're having to go through mountain ranges, the Sierra Nevadas, largely, so they're having to wind through or bore through these mountains. It takes a lot longer to do that. So in theory, they wouldn't be able to build as much. But the Union Pacific has problems of their own. Again, that has to do with where they are building. The Great Plains might be flat, but they also don't have a lot of trees. And railroads are made up in part by timber, the railroad ties. So you have to have timber to build these railroads. And for the Union Pacific, they had to ship that lumber or that timber to where they were, oftentimes from faraway places out east. So that slowed the process down, lack of water, Plains Indians attacking them. They had a lot of things to worry about that could slow them down. But for the most part, the Union Pacific could build a little bit faster. In 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad will be completed at Promontory Point, Utah. This is where you get this is what this picture is, the golden spike and the welding of the rail ceremony that takes place as the two companies come together and connect their tracks, and the Transcontinental Railroad is complete. But the way in which, again, the government sets it up for speed to where it can happen very quickly. In a matter of 5 years, they have built the first Transcontinental Railroad, but it also sets up a system of a lot of corruption and scandal and bad practices on the railroad company. So let me kind of try and explain that a little bit. The corruption part of this and the money side of things. This is a map. This is called the checkerboard kind of land system. So you can see right in the middle is the railroad track. And I mentioned that the company would get 200 feet per side of the track. So 400 feet in total as a corridor for their track, and as much as they build. And then the government also is going to give them 1,280 acres of land for every mile. So that's just land in other parts of the West. Also, they're going to give them alternating square miles of land. So that's what this is showing. This is what the checkerboard is. So the dark squares are the land given to the railroad. The white squares are land that the government continues to own. So the way that it basically works, and the way that the government is planning to capitalize on this, is this. So if let's say the Union Pacific, so they're building the railroad, the black squares are their land. So they get a square mile of land here, and then a square mile of land alternating on the other side, and then it alternates back to this side and that side, and it just continues on like that. And then these railroad companies can take that land and they can sell it to people. And the reason they would do that, think about what a railroad is good at doing. It's a very efficient way of moving people and materials to other parts of the country, specifically back east at this time, to the factories and stuff. But for a railroad company, you need to, just having tracks out in the middle of the desert, in the middle of the plains or whatever, they don't have much value. The value comes when when towns start to pop up and people start to settle in the area. Now the railroads have more value because more people are using their system. So after you build a railroad, if you can sell land to people and encourage them to move out and live right off of your railroad, and these towns are created right beside where you built this railroad, then that's just going to increase the value of your land. For the government, what they have to do is they have to hold off and let these railroad companies sell their land. And then as more people move into these black squares, well, the white squares that are still left vacant, now their value rises because more people are wanting to move out there. There's demand for wanting to live out there, and the government can sell that land to people at a much higher price and make money off of it, is the idea. So that's all well and good. There's a lot of corruption that comes from that because anytime, or a lot of times when something becomes a money game like that, and it leads to a lot of corruption, bad practices, especially in the building of railroads. At the Transcontinental Railroad, there was a lot of problems years after it was completed because of the way in which it was built. Because they were so rushed to do it, they oftentimes used poor material. They didn't build it very well to where, years down the road, there would be washouts and they would have to replace ties and rails and all of these other problems that would pop up because of the speed in which they built this railroad line. So that's the basic idea. And this system, although it was used at first with the Transcontinental Railroad, it would continue to be used after that. There were other railroad lines that were built, a lot of times with government subsidies. By the end of the century, by the start of the 1900s, there's going to be 5 separate transcontinental railroads in the United States, or in the United States out west. Most of them built with government subsidies. So you've got some down in the south that connect LA to Houston, even all the way to New Orleans down here. You've got some that connect St. Louis to Los Angeles, and even some up here, up north. You've got all of these different railroad systems that are being built that use that same system of government subsidy, getting land grants and block grants from the government to help fund it. There is an example, James Hill, of a private railroad company building a railroad, a transcontinental railroad, without government funding at all. So James Hill, he becomes known, he's the one that does this. He becomes known as the empire builder for his ability to do this without public money. He builds what becomes known as the Great Northern Railroad, which is up here, that connects Tacoma to Minneapolis and so on. But he gets people to invest in his company and uses this money to help fund this railroad that he's building. He also has practices such as, when he would encounter a mountain, instead of going over the mountain or going like tunneling through it, which was the common practice then, he would just go around it. And this allowed for longer trains so that they could haul more goods, and then they could travel they could make more money off of it. In fact, when you compare companies that built using government money and Hill's company that used private money, most railroad companies that used government funds did not make a profit. They never made up the money that they spent to build the railroad. James Hill not only made up the money, he actually earned money. Of the people who invested to help pay for it, most of them got like a 5% return. So they made more money by investing in it, which is always a good thing for your private company. But it just showed that, people didn't have to rely on the government to get these things done. Private companies could do it on their own. So with the railroad system being built and that continuing to expand, the West is very quickly becoming more connected to the East. And the whole point of that is moving people out there, but also moving goods back to the East so that they can be manufactured and then trade and sold and traded to other countries. This industrialism for the United States in the railroad and whatnot is making it's making us money. It's making us a wealthier country very quickly because we're able to produce so much stuff, and we're not reliant on other countries because we have all those raw materials. We don't have to bring something in from another country. We have it all here. So we're able to make a lot of money, and we are very quickly going to become a very wealthy country. This is kind of the start of America becoming one of the wealthiest countries in the entire world, is this rapid spread of industrialism. A couple of other things outside of the railroad that start other innovations that happen at this time that just kind of show the way that industrialism is spreading and connecting different parts of the world quicker. So the invention of the telephone by Alexander Graham Bell is one of those inventions. We've talked about the telegraph and how that completely changed the way we communicate in our country. Well, the telephone is going to speed that up even more. Being able to directly talk to each other in different parts of the country is going to continue to speed up that communication. Thomas Edison in the late part of the 1800s is going to create and demonstrate his light bulb for the first time. Another one back on trains is George Westinghouse. He will create air brakes for trains, which is a huge innovation for the safety. We talked about telegraphs again, how they were first created with safety in mind for railroads to try and prevent railroad collisions. Air brakes are another safety feature. You remember watching the crash course video, a big fear that people had on railroads is, trains are moving very fast, and there was this big fear of derailment. There were a lot of derailments and stuff like that. So air brakes made it to where trains obviously could stop a lot quicker than they could in the past using mechanical brakes, just based on the way that they work. And air brakes are still used today. Air brakes are used on a lot of vehicles. You're probably more used to them like on school buses. They have air brakes, and it just uses compressed air to stop a heavy vehicle like a train or a bus at a much quicker time. So all of these different innovations are just showing that the United States is developing and industrializing very quickly. That's the main point of really this chapter, or at least this part of the chapter, is how quickly we're able to industrialize in such a short period of time and what that's going to mean. Now, what we're going to continue to talk about in the next kind of half of this chapter is we'll talk about some economics and some of the business models that are changing, but also what all of this means for the country. Like, all of this stuff is great, and they all have a lot of pros and benefits for the country. The wealth that is being created in our country is good, but it also can lead to some negatives. that wealth and what that means for our country and who is benefiting from that wealth, income inequality, all of that stuff. So there are a lot of pros to the industrialism that is spreading out west, but there's also a lot of cons that we need to make sure we cover. So that's what we'll kind of pick up on next week. A couple of things just to wrap up. You do have homework. That is the Section 2 review, which is on Classroom. It's on page 331, but you'll do, you're just going to do numbers 1 through 4. You don't have to do the STAR question. So make sure you do that. And then you've also got to do your attendance for this. So for that, I mentioned the 2 railroad companies that built the Transcontinental Railroad, Central Pacific and Union Pacific. I need you to tell me which group of laborers, which group of workers worked for each company. So who mainly made up and worked for the Union Pacific, who mainly made up and worked for Central Pacific Railroads in building the Transcontinental Railroad. All right, so that's your attendance. Do your homework. And then that is all you've got for this week. If you've got any questions, obviously shoot me an email or text or whatever, and I will gladly help you out. All right, see you guys later.